Alrighty, so, will facility dogs get you in the doghouse? Implications for juror decisions. We're Zack, Ayer, Natalie Gomez, AJ Miller, and Shelby Summer.
So testifying in court is a super nerve-wracking experience for witnesses in general, especially those that have experienced a violent crime, specifically children or those with mental disabilities. And they can experience re-traumatization through details of the case or the defendant's present just within court. So some accommodations that can relieve some of the trauma for these witnesses include inanimate objects like food, toys, people, or facility dogs. And these accommodations can lead to a more effective witness testimony. So facility dogs are well-trained dogs that sit or lie down next to the witness during their testimony, and they provide a calming effect. They also lower the witness's heart rate, blood pressure, and anxiety, and increase self-esteem, which can lead to an overall better and more accurate testimony. And currently there are 265 facility dogs in 41 states. So there are some concerns about facility dogs. It is thought that it might influence juror perceptions of both the witness and the defendant. So these juror perceptions can lead to an increase of feelings of sympathy towards the witness, which will then have the jurors see the defendant in a more negative light, which is why some defense lawyers don't want facility dogs to be present within court. And they can also lead to appeals or overturns. There haven't been any overturns, but the way that the appeals happen is when the defendant is convicted, they'll come back and say that they didn't receive a fair trial just because of the juror perceptions from the facility dog. And they're usually not granted because there aren't any studies that say that there is an influence of facility dogs on juror perceptions, and the few studies that do exist focus just on children in specifically sex abuse cases. So there are also other factors that can lead to different juror perceptions of the witness and the defendant, and these are extra legal factors or anything that doesn't have to do with evidence. So there's like a list here. Some of the factors are age, race, demeanor, or like how the defendant or witness carries themselves within the courtroom, socioeconomic status or like financial stability, accommodations that might be present, or gender.
Okay, so we wanted to examine the influence of gender because previous research suggested that the gender of the victim could influence juror judgments towards either the witness or the defendant. Previous research also indicates that there is a relationship between victim gender and juror composition, such as female jurors feeling more sympathy towards the female victim rather than the male. It has also been suggested that the influence of stereotypes and stigmas surrounding gender roles of male victimization can influence juror judgments in the courtroom. So why are these elements important? The addition of a facility dog into the courtroom may interfere with the defendant's Sixth Amendment right, which is their right to an impartial jury, due to feelings of sympathy that may be towards the witness because of the addition of the facility dog. But on the other hand, previous research has indicated that the addition of the facility dog provides many benefits towards the witness's mental health and their ability to get through their testimony. The facility dog's presence could have an impact on legal proceedings as a whole, such as calls for an appeal, and previous research has not examined the interaction of the victim's gender with the presence of the facility dog, so we wanted to examine this. The present study's purpose was to understand how the presence of a facility dog to aid a testifying victim may affect jurors' decisions as a function of the victim's gender, and our study was a 2-by-2 between participants design. When it comes to jurors' judgments, we expected to find there would be no main effect of the presence of the facility dog. This is based on previous research that juror judgments are not influenced by the presence of the facility dog. We also expected to find a main effect of victim gender based on previous research surrounding male stigmatism of male victims in the courtroom. We expected there would be an interaction between the presence of the facility dog and the victim gender, in which the male victim with the facility dog present would be perceived more negatively than the male victim without the dog, and for there to be no differences between the female victims. Our participants' average age was around 44 years old. They ranged from 19 to 84 years old, and more than half of our participants were female, and they were found from all across South Carolina. The participants were given one of 4 case versions in which a 21-year-old college student was violently assaulted and ended up in the hospital. The participants read opening and closing statements, victim cross and direct examination, and prosecution and defense testimony, in which all of the case details were held constant except for the victim's gender or the presence of a facility dog. The participants also answered a 21-item questionnaire in which they answered defendant or witness appraisal questions such as how credible was the witness from 1 to 9, and how likable was the defendant from 1 to 9. They also answered questions about the outcome of the trial, along with manipulation checks and demographic questions. These are examples of the pictures included in each of the 4 case variations, in which the participants were either given a male or a female participant, each with or without a dog.
That brings us to our results. You're probably wondering what they actually were. So, as hypothesized, you may recall, we suggested that the presence of the facility dog would not have a significant effect on our participants' appraisals of either the victim or the defendant, and indeed, our data supported that hypothesis. We did not find a significant main effect of the facility dog's presence. So, great. But we did find an interesting phenomenon when we took a closer look at the data. Clicker does not work.
Okay, I got it.
Cool. So you can see here, we decided to break down the guilty verdict. So for all of our participants who indicated guilty for our 3 charges, seen here, about twice as many of the participants who voted guilty had the facility dog version of the court case, as opposed to those who didn't. Now, for this finding, we could not establish significance because we didn't have enough people indicate guilty. Only about 1/3 of the participants in total indicated they thought the defendant was guilty. However, as we continue conducting research and gathering data, if we can establish significance, this is pretty revolutionary because out of all of the literature with the facility dog, this would be the first study to actually suggest that the presence of a facility dog negatively impacts judgments about the defendant. Next, for our second hypothesis, it was also supported by our data. We did find a significant main effect of victim gender for evaluations of the victim for these 3 appraisals. So, overall, generally speaking, our participants felt more empathy towards the female victim over the male victim. They felt more sympathy towards the female victim over the male victim, and they felt that the female victim was more honest overall than the male victim. So as you can see, generally speaking, the female victim was perceived more positively than the male victim. So we decided to look at the underlying mechanisms driving the significance for our findings for victim gender. So we decided to break down our analysis of empathy, sympathy, and honesty based on our participants' gender. So you can see here we divvied it up between the male participant evaluations and the female participant evaluations. And for empathy and sympathy, 2 out of 3 of the evaluations that were significant, we found that the significance was driven by the female participants, which meant that the female participants were much more empathetic towards the female victim over the male victim, as before, and they were much more sympathetic towards the female victim over the male victim to such an extent that it drove significance. The same could be said for honesty. It was approaching significance. It wasn't quite there. Again, with more data, it might also approach significance. And so yeah, those were our findings. Now, finally, for our hypotheses, for our last one, you may recall about interactions. We did not find any significant interactions across any of our variables between the dependent variables and our 2 independent variables of facility dog and victim gender. So there were no significant interactions. We were incorrect there.
So then this leads us to question what are the implications of our results. And the first is that with facility dogs, there is, contrary to the beliefs of many defense lawyers, there is no significant evidence to suggest that facility dogs should not be utilized within the courtroom and thereby provide the necessary benefits and potential benefits to the victim when testifying in court. And with regard to gender, we tried to understand why were the females the one driving this. And within this, first 60% of our participants were female, but we believe it has to do with in-group homogeneity versus out-group heterogeneity. And what that means is that people that are similar to us are going to be attributed better characteristics by us. We're going to view them in a more positive light. But those who differ from us are going to be viewed in a more negative light. So what we believe is that this is what occurred within the female population. But why did we not witness this within the male population? Well, this is because of the stigmatizations that exist around male victims. With our in-group homogeneity, we believe and attribute those things to our own self-esteem. So when male victims are viewed as more likely to have been weak or not defend themselves, males are going to view that in a negative light and distance themselves from this. And this is known as the black sheep effect. So we try to distance that person from us because they didn't provide the normative behaviors that we associate with ourselves. It has also been demonstrated that females have higher levels of empathy than males. They're better able to place themselves within the shoes of someone else than the male participants would be able to. So this would lead to higher levels of empathy exhibited by the females. And all of this, in short, is consistent with the previous findings of other studies. So some limitations to this is that a lot of our participants were pulled from places that are correlated with higher education, such as schools, libraries, as well as coffee shops. So we believe that this may have affected the critical thinking abilities of our participants and therefore resulted in being able to differentiate between the dog, the presence of the dog, and the actual important findings of the case, which means that this would not be generalizable potentially to the full population. And inadvertently, during the conduction of our study, the Kyle Rittenhouse trial was going on. And we believe that this may have led to a hyper-awareness about judicial proceedings and made participants pay more attention to what was going on in the trial, or in our case. So this then leads us to future research, and we would like to observe how does the presence of a dog actively affect the victim when testifying. And we want to see if it is just a calming effect and just providing emotional support, or whether it makes a more effective testimony that is being presented by the victim. And that then leads us to your questions.
Any questions for this group? Yes.
I was going to ask how you got your participants. You said they were from all over the state. Did you drive all over and go to libraries?
So we come from different areas across the town, and a lot of us actually went back to our hometowns to start trying to find participants in areas that we were more comfortable with. For example, I pulled them from my mother's workplace and got them in there, and everybody just went around to different places.
Most of them were taken from public spaces like libraries, coffee shops, etc.
Any other questions? All right, very good.